Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. This week, we're talking about why podcast apps are developing their own original content. Podcasting as a medium has been around for about 13 years now, and for most of that time, you'd find that most podcasts were platform agnostic. When a new episode was released, it would appear pretty much simultaneously across all podcast apps. Sure, podcasters place most of their promotional efforts on iTunes, but that's because it accounted for most of all podcast listening. But over the last few years, the podcast and audio app space has gotten more competitive, and because of this, we've seen some of these apps marketing exclusive content. Spotify, for instance, has signed deals with podcast companies like Gimlet so that it gets an exclusive window on new episodes before they're published to all other podcast apps. In some cases, podcast apps are actually bankrolling and producing their own podcasts in an effort to differentiate themselves from other apps. The hit show Missing Richard Simmons was produced by Stitcher Premium and exclusively windowed there. This apparently pissed off the executives at Apple since they refused to feature the show on iTunes. Audible launched Audible Channels, a platform for its own podcasts that aren't available on any other apps. And now add CastBox to the list of podcast apps that are producing their own shows. An app with 15 million downloads, CastBox has recently launched Off Track with Hinch and Rossi, a show about auto racing, and it has several other podcasts in development. I recently interviewed Peter Vincer, head of global strategic partnerships at CastBox, about why the company is producing its own shows and whether podcast apps are taking a page from Netflix's strategy. Let's jump right into it. Hey, Peter, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So you're the head of a global partnerships of a company called CastBox. Can you start by talking about what CastBox is?
Sure. So CastBox is a global multi-platform podcast app, player, podcatcher, whatever you want to call it. We're actually the largest multi-platform podcast app there is at the moment. Apple Podcasts, of course, dwarfs us by a lot. We've been around for a little over 2 years, founded in China by a couple ex-Googlers. And we finally launched an iOS app about 6 months ago. So we're now available on both. We're active on all home devices and Android Auto and what's Apple's called CarPlay, I think, and everything else. And we're mostly focused at the moment in my department on building a global podcast network and developing some really great original content.
So when you say you're the largest multi-platform network, what do you mean by that?
I guess it's a fancy way of being able to say largest, since Apple Podcasts is so much bigger than us. We're the biggest on Android. So we're the biggest on Android by a lot. Since we're on iOS and Android, we can cleverly say largest multi-platform because that gets Apple out of the way.
Yeah. So you guys are a bit bigger than Stitcher, which is usually the one that's most often name checked in addition to Apple.
Correct. Unfortunately, and this is a bit confusing, we happen to have two apps on iOS. One, if you were to search podcast, not iOS, sorry, Android. If you were to search podcast in the Google Play Store, the first app that would show up is our purple app. It's called Podcast Player by CastBox. That was the first app that we launched just over 2 years ago. And about a year after that launch, we realized that a lot of the specific there were a lot of engineering challenges with kind of caused by the foundation that we had started with. And so strategically, we decided to start fresh. And so we still have the Purple app, which has about 8 million plus downloads at the moment. And that still lives, and it's slightly different UI, but not much. And then we launched about a year ago, maybe a little less, the Orange app, which is probably the one most people are familiar with. That has about 7 million downloads at the moment, and that is the app that has received Google's App of Excellence Award. They're both actually Editor's Choice apps, which I don't believe any other podcast-specific apps are in the Google Play Store. So we've gotten a lot of love there, and now we're focusing heavily on building out our iOS apps capability.
So like the podcast app is like, it's a very crowded space with obviously iTunes dominating the field. Last statistic I looked up, it had somewhere north of 50% of all podcast use. You have everything from Stitcher to Google Play to Overcast to Player.fm. It goes on and on and on. Like, given that it's such a crowded space, like how do you differentiate yourself in the field?
Good question. The crowded word that you used, I think, is fitting in this for this answer, because a lot of people would say that a lot of the apps that they use today, whether that's everyone's favorite Apple or on iOS or any of the others, tend to feel crowded and cluttered and not the simplest, easiest to use or sleekest. And so that's kind of the focus that we've tried to have, is real tech forward. And simple and sleek and easy to use, easy to navigate. And then we also try to really focus on discovery. We actually launched a feature last August called In Audio Search, where it allows you to search the actual text of most major podcasts, searching for keywords or phrases. So you could type in Donald Trump in our search bar, and it could pop up either channels that are named something that involves Donald Trump, episode, or in audio text. And so that's a pretty unique feature that really helps with discoverability. And we're working on building out even more capability there.
So it's like largely a UX kind of case, in the sense of like the hope that a consumer who's trying out a few of these podcast apps will see that one is a little bit easier to use or caters to their needs a little bit more than all the others.
Well, up to this point, that has been our strategy. Now, what I'm working on, myself and my team, is developing a number of creative and unique original content podcasts as Castbox originals, and that's meant to build the brand and to help differentiate ourselves from a lot of the others. Obviously, Stitcher does the same, but that's really the only main one in this space that has an original content focus. And even there, it's a bit more segmented because, of course, Earwolf is who would handle a lot of the original programming. There's, of course, Stitcher Originals now, which is somewhat newer. But then that's kind of separated by, they've got mid-roll, they've got Stitcher, they've got Earwolf, they've got much segmentation, whereas Castbox is all under one proverbial roof.
Well, I wouldn't say Stitcher's the only one. So Stitcher's definitely doing it with like Stitcher Premium and doing kind of windowing there. So we have Spotify, which is doing kind of windowing deals with like Gimlet and some of the other major platforms, where it shows up on Spotify 2 weeks in advance or something like that. You could argue Audible Channels, which they don't call themselves a podcast app, but they're essentially a podcast app. They're producing exclusive content on theirs to kind of differentiate the Audible app more. So it seems like this is an emerging trend within podcast apps. Like we discussed, it's a crowded space, so they're kind of adopting. Would you say it's almost like a Netflix strategy of saying, there's going to be a lot of aggregators out there. We need to start producing our own original content to kind of create that differentiation?
Netflix is an interesting comparison, and it's probably the one I would use most, because we're lucky enough that in podcasting, the nature of the business is advertising focused. So kind of most everything is available to everyone that wants to be a podcast player. But then, yes, the goal is eventually to create enough content enough good content where people are, and I don't know what the ultimate strategy will be for us a year or 2 years down the road. I know for now, we are not going to restrict any of our shows whatsoever. We're not ever going to window any of our shows. We don't want to in any way hinder the potential growth of any of our podcasts. And that's best for revenue. That's best for our creators. And that's best for the brand. So ultimately, there may be a different strategy, but certainly not for a long time. But yes, Netflix is a really good example.
Yeah, interesting that you're not planning on even windowing the original podcast. Would that hinder your differentiation aspect then? Because isn't the whole point of doing the original podcast is because it's supposed to be, even if it's for only a brief period of time on your app only, and that's the reason that's kind of the extra impetus that the user has to download your app over the others?
Kind of. Yeah, I think that if we have a great app that delivers a great user experience, and if we have great shows, and if our brand is something that resonates with the users and listeners that we're trying to target, and if we say you can listen to this everywhere because we're trying to be cool, but we'd prefer you give CastBox a shot, I think that may resonate with listeners enough for them to try us out. Of course, that will somewhat limit the amount of traffic we can drive to CastBox specifically, but on the flip side, there will be great benefit to the shows themselves, and they'll be able to grow at a much more healthy and organic rate.
So tell me about some of the original shows that you are creating. Like I came across, there's an IndyCar podcast that you're doing. Tell me about what the actual process here, how you approach these partnerships.
Sure. Obviously, there's a myriad of ways that we approach the partnerships. The first podcast that we just launched, which you're familiar with, called Off Track with Hinch and Rossi, is two IndyCar drivers. And that was actually through my network of people that I knew and was close to them. And it just was one that made way too much sense. They're both naturals behind the mic, and they're both really good IndyCar drivers. Especially if you saw the first race, you'd see that it's going to be a great season. So that seemed like a no-brainer for us to kind of kick off the network. And then we've got a bunch of other ones that are in the hopper. We have a big partnership with Studio 71, and that we haven't really done any PR for any of those other ones. That's coming in the upcoming weeks. But so Studio 71 is a big influencer management company. They manage a lot of YouTubers and social celebrities, that influencer kind of thing. And we're launching 10 podcasts with them over the next couple months. All original content, although we will also have any worthy and fitting standalone audio content from their existing YouTube channels. There's one differentiator, in fact, because that will probably live just on CastBox. We haven't made an ultimate determination on all of those. We'll probably decide on a case-by-case basis. And then we've got another really big partnership we're about to announce with Herdwell, which is the first social influencer meets up emerging music label. They're housed out of CAA in Los Angeles, and they've got a partnership with Sony, or I think maybe Sony is partially invested in them. I'm not really sure what the relationship is there, but they're close with Sony as well. And they work with some of the biggest influencers on the planet. And so we're launching kind of an influencer meets music podcast that should have a new episode at least every other week. And we're doing a big push at a lot of the music festivals in the next couple months to kind of get that one on the map. We, in fact, even have a billboard outside of Coachella. That's, if it hasn't already gone up, it'll be up any day. And then probably certainly one of my most exciting projects is, I guess I'll give you a sneak peek. It's called This Sounds Serious. And it is I guess at heart, a true crime mockumentary, a full-length true crime mockumentary. It should be about 8 to 10 episodes. It's being done by the creators of Dexter Guff is Smarter Than You, and You Can Be Too, if you're familiar with that show.
I've heard of it, yeah.
And
it's like a mock motivational speaker or something like that.
Exactly, yeah. It's I just absolutely loved it, and struck up a friendship with the creators there. And they're actually most famous for a radio show they have in Canada with CBC, Canadian Broadcasting, which is kind of the NPR of Canada. And they've had one of the longest running shows, radio shows, every week, which is like local, funny, kind of Onion style news. And they travel around, do live shows too. And it's just been a really huge hit in Canada for a number of years. So they're starting the final season soon. And they're going to be making certainly a few podcasts for us, at least, if not more. And the partnership is growing by the day. So that's a really exciting one as well. That should release sometime in mid-April.
And like, how are these partnerships structured? Like, do you own CastBox own the IP, and then these hosts are like paid contractors, or is this like a revenue share type thing? Like, are you guys like 100% producing these podcasts soup to nuts? Like what, or is it more kind of like a loose type partnership? How are you guys approaching that?
It's all different. So off track, we share the IP with the two hosts. Studio 71, those are kind of existing brands, and so it didn't make a lot of sense to me to push for that for the IP on those. And they actually were willing to and actually wanted to produce all of those shows themselves. They produce a lot of video content at the moment outside of they have a number of studios in LA actually. And so this is kind of their first foray into podcasting, but certainly not production in general. So they're handling that one. Heardwell, they are handling that on their own, and they own the IP there as well. This Sounds Serious, we own the majority of the IP there, and they are producing that as they're a big production house. They're a video production house as well out of Vancouver. So it's all different. And then there's actually a couple other podcasts that I'm forgetting at the moment. We've just got so many that are coming out the next couple months that we'll own part of and are being produced by some partners of ours. So the goal is maybe eventually. I'm sorry, go on.
Okay. Oh, I was just kind of wondering, like, is it kind of analogous going back to that Netflix comparison, like where it's like, here's the money, you guys are the creative people, you produce this, we're kind of hands off, or like, is this like something where you guys are very, very intimately involved from the beginning to the end?
Although all of our partners so far have been incredibly willing to share and have been really eager to share a lot of the creative decision making and a lot of the information that's coming out early on in each of these projects, we really have just kind of let them do their own thing. Most, if not all, of our partners are, they've been in this either the podcasting business or the creator business for much longer than we have, and they've gotten to where they are by doing what they know best. And so we have been very hands off, although we probably could have a greater say if we wanted to.
So you mentioned that you guys aren't really doing windowing. I've heard that like windowing has actually backfired in some senses, and I was wondering if this is maybe the reason why you guys aren't doing it. Like I seem to remember that Missing Richard Simmons, because it was windowed, I think maybe on Stitcher, I forget which platform, like iTunes, which had been gearing up to like do a big promotion for it, completely they reversed that decision and did like no promotion for it. I know Apple Music, this isn't podcast, but it's audio related, where Apple Music has pretty much stopped windowing songs and stuff like that because Spotify has completely ignored it in its playlist, which has caused some of these big albums to tank in their sales and streaming. Like, is that like a major threat for all these different podcast apps, that if they decide to window, then they're going to be virtually ignored on all the other podcast apps? We didn't make our decision based off of what else has been going on in the market. But it just kind of seemed intuitive to me that, if we want happy creators and we want happy partners and we want the shows to do as well financially as possible, and we want the brand to be recognized as widely as possible, then it makes sense to open. And it also is the best for the listeners. We want all of our stuff to be available everywhere. So it just kind of made sense to us to just not be restrictive at all. And I think, the examples that you shared, it seems like common sense to me that if you have a good show and it's, and you're happy with everything that surrounds it, you'd want that to be as widely heard and recognized as possible. And maybe if one day we see a value in being slightly more restrictive, we certainly reserve that right. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So let's switch gears a little bit. What's the monetization approach for podcast apps? Because I haven't seen a really clear winning model. Like iTunes, I don't see any monetization there. It's basically just a lock-in for Apple devices to get you to get just using their services more. Stitcher, obviously, they're trying the Stitcher Premium route, and I think they're owned by some major media conglomerate now, so there might be other integration there. Overcast, I think. Yeah.
Scripts, I think, and I think that was actually sold to Discovery recently. So yeah, it's been a couple acquisitions.
I don't know if I saw that one. I saw that news. And then Overcast, they originally did subscriptions. Now they're doing like in-app advertising. Seems like they're like there's no winning model yet. How have you guys approached it, and what do you think is going to be ultimate winner there?
Great question. It's of course we can have in the back of our minds or on a whiteboard somewhere, a 12, 24, 36 month plan on how to monetize. I think this is a rapidly emerging market and things are changing. And, I think that there's probably eventually going to be a trend towards premium content and that it's delivered in an ad-free version or, with bonus features or extra episodes or full-length interviews or all of that type of stuff that could be passed along for a monthly donation or recurring cost that the fans pay. And that, Patreon is kind of ushering that in, and some other companies are. So that's one way, and taking a cut of that. We could also deliver ad-free versions of our podcasts or others in a bundle, sort of like a Spotify, Pandora type offering, or Netflix, I guess would be another example there. And then one of our apps at the moment is monetized via display ads. So that drives some revenue for the Purple app called Podcast Player. There's a lot of opportunities for us to ultimately create revenue, but I think it's too early to try any of those, to be honest. I think the goal at this point is to just make sure people know what Castbox is and recognize that we're one of the good guys. That's the goal.
Uh-huh. So you mentioned Patreon. For those who aren't as familiar with it, a lot of podcasters use it to basically build subscription revenue. You pay $1 a month, $5 a month, $10 a month, whatever the price is, and then for that price you support the podcaster, and you also often get like extra goodies, like extra exclusive podcasts and stuff. So you think that there might be some way that instead of having to go to like an outside platform like Patreon, they could build in those services into the app itself so that it's just a one-click, your credit card's already on file. This is the podcast you not only want to listen to the free version of, but you want to support in some way, like building that into the podcast app itself.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. We're taking one thing at a time because, I was the first U.S. employee for this company starting last June. So, within a short amount of time, we've taken some pretty big strides. I think that makes sense as maybe a potential next step. We'll get this network stood up and then start figuring out next phases. But I think that's probably one of the top possibilities.
So one other thing that I don't see really discussed much is the YouTube model, where YouTube says you bring the content, we'll supply the programmatic ads via pre-roll and stuff like that. We're starting to see programmatic start making its way into podcasting. It seems like that would be, a way that podcast apps could monetize and say, hey, like instead of you guys handling your own advertising, we'll just insert mid-roll, pre-roll ads into it that are programmatically served up, and we'll take a cut of that. Do you think that that's possible, or you think that's too much of a challenge because the app space is too fragmented?
It's funny you bring that up because the U.S. market, the podcast market, being advertising based, kind of limits the capability of that type of broad scale model. Whereas in other places like China, there's only a few apps that exist. It's not an advertising based market. And so over there, people pay per podcast they want to listen to, and the ads can be delivered in a programmatic fashion like you mentioned. Here, everyone is really ingrained in the existing industry model of being driven by advertising, and all of these. We would obviously have to have some significant partners that would buy into that model. And if we were to do that, then that would fragment their ability to sell ads elsewhere, or we'd have to have different versions. So I think conceptually that makes a lot of sense. I just don't know how realistic that is.
What about one thing we've just seen just in the last 2 years or so where it's really exploded is the rise of connected devices, voice activated devices, not just like Alexa and HomePod and all that kind of stuff, but also, in-car apps, stereos, different things like that. What's the strategy there for a company like yours? Are these a threat to your company, or are you guys trying to quickly adapt and on these?
I love all of the things that you just mentioned, and I think they'll only help our cause, as long as, again, as long as we're delivering, a great product for people to use, as long as our Alexa skills or Google Home skills, or I forget what Apple's one is called, HomePod, as long as we've got all of that dialed in, I think, there'll always be a space for the Castboxes and the Spotifys and the rest. And I think, additionally, all of those emerging technologies only make our case, or only make the case for audio stronger, and I envision, a world 5 or 10 years from now where we're not scrolling through a Facebook or an Insta feed, but instead we're waking up and saying, Alexa, go through my feed, and a lot of it is creators, influencers, and the like sharing audio content because we can consume so much more of it. So I think it's ushering in probably a new wave of technology and usage that doesn't really exist today. So I'm excited and hopeful.
So with HomePod, at least, I don't know what their podcast strategy is, but there has been, things written about how it's a threat to Spotify because the only real integration with HomePod is Apple Music. Is that a challenge, not just with Apple, obviously, but any of these connected devices where you guys are having to, where partnerships are being formed and stuff like that, where, there's because they're voice activated, they have to have default apps that they use whenever they're playing podcasts. I think with Alexa, it's TuneIn. So I guess my question is how do you kind of navigate those waters? In the sense of without being left behind as all these partnerships or exclusive things are being done on these devices.
Sure. Well, at the moment, I know at least on my Google Home device and my Alexa device that I use, if I say, play Michael Bublé on Spotify, it'll play it on Spotify. If I say play, Joe Rogan's latest podcast episode on Spotify, even though TuneIn is the built-in, it will still do that. So I think people are still most eager to use and pleased when they can use whatever app or software that they're familiar with, wherever they have their playlists. I know if I had to today change from Spotify to somewhere else, I'm sure there would be capability to port all of that stuff over. But I'm still familiar with Spotify for my music playing, and that's what I use. And I think it'll probably behoove a lot of these connected devices to have a more open ecosystem where people can use their favorite app within those and not be restrictive. Obviously, if they decide to say if Alexa says only TuneIn can play your podcasts, and if HomePod says only you can only use Apple Music to play your music, then we'll have to be reactive and probably figure something else out. But at the moment, I think we're probably heading toward a more open and connected tech community, but time will tell.
So most podcast apps right now are focused on podcast consumption, but we're seeing some entrants like Anchor that are trying to make producing podcasts easier, even almost trying to create almost like a social media platform for audio. I've been really skeptical that there's a real demand for this. Do you think that there's a demand for this for podcast apps that in terms of just making it really easy to kind of do a podcast without having to, have some specific, hosts like Libsyn or, all the other kinds of the hoops you have to jump over to launch a podcast?
We share the same sentiment with the Anchors of the world. I like Anchor a lot. I think the UI is slick, and I think it's really fun to use and play around with. But I don't believe the demand is there yet. And we have the capability in our app for you to, record and upload and distribute the feed elsewhere. And within Castbox, we haven't seen a lot of demand there. And more broadly, the podcasters of today are typically not someone in their garage talking about, their favorite likes and dislikes. They're production studios and big networks and people that have been, entities that have been creating content in other formats. So I think eventually, once we get to a place where, people are sharing much more audio socially, that there will be a need. But I think we're probably a couple years to maybe more than that out from there actually being a great enough demand to justify having that those capabilities.
So even though Castbox does have that functionality, you guys are just not seeing that much user-generated content through those features.
No, gosh, I forget the number of users that we even have that use it. But I think like even the most popular user that's creating within Castbox and distributing, they have like they get maybe a couple thousand plays. So it might be like a big friends and family type thing, planning an annual reunion or something. Other than that, and when you think about it logically, there just aren't that many people that have something interesting or unique to say, that know how to grow it well enough in today's ecosystem, that has the need to create it within our app or Anchors or anyone else.
Yeah, it's ironic that in an era when we see constant think pieces about how much millennials hate voicemail, that there's also these separate industry pieces saying we need an app to where basically it would boil down to people just leaving voicemails that are kind of mass distributed via some kind of social app. And I just don't see that being widely adopted by people at all.
Not now for certain, but it is kind of funny. I mean, we really certainly video is not getting smaller, but we are kind of trending back towards the radio audio heyday of 10, 15 and way longer than that years ago. So it's funny how cycles are with media and consumption.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Peter, that's all the time we have for today. Tell us where people can find you.
You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at Peter Vincer or something similar. I forget all my exact handles. And then, of course, Castbox is castbox.fm. And you can find the Castbox app on iOS and Android.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon.
Okay, that's all I have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.